Welcome to the first ever episode of The Data Mind. We are a podcast and videocast that talks about what the data is actually saying from people who actually know. I'm Kaylee Garbaseski, analyst turned advisor, who's worked across the world over the past 15 years in the analytics space. I founded The Data Mind specifically to work on telling people what the data is saying and removing bias where possible. Today, I'm very excited to be welcoming my longtime friend and senior leader in the airline industry, Jacob Courtade, to hear his take on where the industry is at a mere 2 months after the COVID-19 pandemic started sweeping across the Western world.
This is The Data Mind.
Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks so much for having me, Kaylee. I'm very excited to be here today.
As I mentioned already, Jacob is a senior leader in the airline industry. He's worked in the industry for over 10 years now. When he's not negotiating with the likes of Delta and American, he's reading all about what's going on the weekends and at night. He's also got his degree from the University of Waterloo in Canada in mathematics. He's lived throughout his career through a number of crises that have directly impacted the airline industry, such as the oil crisis that was a direct result of the 2008-2009 banking collapse, massive currency fluctuations between Europe and North America. He has also lived through the Icelandic ash cloud, which hit in 2010 and ended up grounding over 95,000 flights and ultimately costing the airline industry north of $1.7 billion. So a pretty huge impact there until today, right? Now we have the COVID-19 pandemic, something that is truly unprecedented. A lot of people have been trying to compare these events, right? But from the airline industry's perspective, how does this compare? Can we even compare it?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money right away saying, can we even compare it? I don't think we can for a couple of reasons. One is the actual number of flights that have stopped because there's just no demand, and the, of course, financial losses that's entailed as airlines still have a lot of their operating expenses. The other is sort of the way that this particular crisis has progressed. Like a lot of the other ones you mentioned, there was more of an initial shock or a couple-day shock or something like that, whereas COVID-19 is slowly at first and then in an accelerating way dried up demand, which has sort of made it very difficult to know when we're at the bottom. It's also, I think, psychologically a lot different because for a long time, everything just seemed to get worse. And when we thought it couldn't get worse, it then got worse, and then that doubled. And I think that was what made this particular situation so very different.
So where are we at today? Can you give us a few numbers on sort of capacity versus this time last year, for example?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to look at it. One stat I recently saw was that for American Airlines, about 99% of their flights, the ones that they're still operating, are less than 20% full. Depending on, again, how you measure number of flights, number of seats, things like that, we're operating right now somewhere between 5 and 10% of the same time last year on a global level. Now, we are starting to see signs of that increasing, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit later.
And so airline capacity in terms of number of passengers moving is different from number of planes moving, right?
Exactly. And it's important to always be clear what you're talking about. I think different customers get that kind of mixed up sometimes.
In the US, at least, we have the CARES Act that's coming into play when it comes to how much capacity actually is available, right?
That's a great point. The CARES Act actually has some stipulations about levels of service maintained by the carriers that are benefiting from it in the US. People ask, why are these planes still flying if so many of them are flying empty? And one reason, not the only reason, but one reason certainly is the requirement for these airlines that are getting this help, both in terms of a bailout and in terms of loans provided by the CARES Act, is a requirement to maintain a certain level of service with a very specific definition.
There have been these huge numbers thrown out in the mass media around how much money was given, but it's kind of without context, right? So can you take us through a little bit more of the numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the CARES Act overall for the aviation sector provides somewhere in the realm of about 60 billion with a B dollars of support. When I say support, that's a combination of both grants, so amounts that don't have to be paid back, and loans, so indebtedness to the US government. And it's for the airlines that actually carry passengers, they're getting about 50 billion of that. Again, roughly speaking, split 50-50 between grants and very low interest loans. For a classic legacy international carrier, of which the US is sort of down to 3, being American, Delta, and United these days, An airline like American, as of a couple of weeks ago, when they last reported their finances, was burning about $70 million a day in cash. And the revenues are, a percentage below 10 of what they were same time last year. So very little to cover their costs. So for them, $70 million a day, they really need to do something about that. Their goal is to get their cash burn down to $50 million a day. That's their goal by the end of June. They were in the CARES Act, I believe, granted 10 or $11 billion. Therefore, their benefit from the CARES Act would last them somewhere in the order of 2 quarters of operations. They didn't have a lot of liquidity at the time of the crisis, aside from what's provided by the CARES Act.
The reason I wanted to ask you that question was just, again, to give context. We've got these huge numbers flying around. In reality, they don't go as far as maybe they sound like they might, but they do have direct impacts on people's lives on the ground, right? So one maybe being job reduction prevention and what the airspace kind of looks like going forward. And again, that confidence, bearing in mind that everything that we'll talk about here in general is just your opinion. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on the bailout and whether you think that there should have been one?
Yeah, it's a very contentious issue for sure. Again, completely my opinion. I do think that it had a role to play. I think that these airlines play a very important role in the backbone of the economy, both in the US, which we've just been talking about, but in the world. There's a number of reasons that society benefits from having airlines with a certain amount of service in place. It's easy to sort of look back and say airlines should have been ready for this and had more cash available and not done so many stock buybacks. I think I'm going to be a little bit less judgmental on the airlines for this and say that, I do believe the number of jobs and the benefit to the economy and to many other things for society warrants some kind of bailout. Would I have structured it the same way as the US government did? I'm sure I would have different opinions on that, but at its core, I do think it makes sense.
So it seems like there are good reasons that the bailout occurred. Whether it's in the US or around the world, are there other reasons that might skew the numbers of capacity related to passenger demand?
Absolutely. So as you said, yes, the CARES Act or other government help is one reason airlines might keep flying, even if there's not many people booked on a certain flight. Some of the others might be to help the healthcare sector, whether they're doctors or nurses or other healthcare professionals that need to get to certain locations. Airlines will keep flights going for other reasons, such as top accounts have some passengers on that flight, or possibly there's a special occasion. On a bigger scale, flights might need to operate empty because the plane needs to get somewhere. So it either has to get to the next city in order to operate a much busier flight, or the crew needs to get somewhere for a similar reason. Another one is actually to do with parking spaces, which are, as you can imagine, at a premium now with so many aircraft not in the air. The aircraft may have operated its last sort of profitable flight for the day, but doesn't have anywhere to park and needs to get to its overnight parking spot in a different city. And finally, it's the second level of the plane that we don't think about as much, the cargo market. We're seeing a lot of new flights introduced by airlines to replace some of the passenger flights purely for a perspective of cargo.
So those two things are pretty interesting. So parking garages for airports, if any billionaires out there want to start building those, they may be in higher demand going forward. And then also when it comes to the cargo shipments, I wonder, do you think that the airspace may segment further into growing out cargo only?
It certainly seems like it. That's a very big trend right now. Several large North American carriers have taken some of their biggest planes, pulled out all the seats, and are using them purely for cargo now. Air Canada's done that. Swiss has done that with their 777s, I think 3 at last count. Just put all the seats in storage and are using both levels just to move cargo around. They're doing cities that they've never done before. So that's definitely a trend as of at least May 2020.
I think I really like the point, though, that if you're not in the industry and you get your hands on some of this data, let's say that you're a news analyst and you want to look at the bailout and you want to look at the stats of who's still flying. If you look at airline movement and the number of flights that are still going and not necessarily just passenger capacity, you would drastically overstate how many people were still flying, right? Because you would potentially infer that those planes were flying because of passenger demand, when really there's all these other reasons. So I think this is a really great example to double check your assumptions before you do any analysis.
Yep, really well said. The two, key metrics that airline analysts look at, explain that different balance. One is the available seat miles, how many miles are being flown by the airline versus, PRASM, so passenger revenue per available seat mile. Very, very differently important metrics.
So overall, the capacity that is currently still available is a combination of some very little passenger demand. We also have some capacity for operational reasons, so the movement, the relocation, the cargo. And then we also have some capacity due to, at least in the US, the level of service agreements as a result of the CARES Act. So zooming back out from just US centric and looking again at the whole world, we're in this sort of literally depressed state operationally. Going forward, what are we going to watch to be able to have some sense of when things might start to pick back up and to what level?
Yeah, that's a great question. My favorite framework for that I've seen so far comes out of a dashboard put together by BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, called TRIP, which stands for the Travel Recovery Insights Portal. The way they've broken that down is into sort of 4 levels. The first being actual physical travel restrictions, and that can either be border closures or quarantine requirements. The next level is looking at consumer intent, going further even into searching, so actual activity related to looking for travel. And then of course, the most direct indicator we have is actual booking. So where people are actually signing up, and specifically to the airline industry where they're buying tickets.
And so going back to the sort of false comparisons to history, those quarantine restrictions are really a game changer for the airline industry. For example, if you're trying to fly for business, but you need to be quarantined for 14 days before you make that meeting, whoever is going to incur that cost is going to think really hard about making that trip now.
Exactly. So the UK just yesterday actually announced the start date of their quarantine as June the 8th. So I think it's an easy argument to make that from June 8th until they end the quarantine, business travel to the UK is going to be more or less dead. Maybe there's a random exception here and there, but there's going to be very, very little to no business traffic. Even on the leisure side that has more flexibility, they're really not feasible to ask people to lock themselves up in a hotel for 2 weeks and then start their trip. I think it is equivalent to a closed border, more or less.
While business meetings and conferences feel like they might be years at least away right now, do we think that maybe some country out there, like the Emirates, for example, might be thinking, hey, if we can get our public health situation under control, we could have a competitive advantage here if we don't quarantine and find some safe way to incentivize people to come and do business meetings here?
Very possibly. We're starting to see different countries introduce different measures to the opposite of what the UK just did. So Italy, of course, this week announced that their borders are opening on June 3rd, which I think was a lot earlier than anyone expected. And that's not just, to other Schengen countries, but that's just internationally. Iceland is another interesting example. They've announced opening of borders, I believe, as of June 15th. Either giving people the option of quarantine, of course, or a test on arrival for COVID. Apparently, the first 2 weeks of testing starting June 15th will actually be covered in cost by the government.
That's very interesting. And that presumably is a rapid test, which means you wouldn't be in the airport for 3 days waiting for a result. You would get it within the day.
I think we're all very curious about the actual logistics of how that will work. I don't believe the details are announced yet. And what happens if you do test positive, what the next step is. But very clearly, to your point, countries are saying, hey, we think we have this situation under much better control. We have systems set up should it get worse. And therefore, we're willing to start to take some steps to sort of open up both for business and for tourism. And of course, both for Italy and Iceland, tourism is a very, very important part of their economy.
Yes. And personally, as you know, I'm very excited that Iceland may be at the forefront, given that I just got married there last year and would love to have a reunion trip. So thank you, Iceland. Without knowing what's going to happen internationally, I suppose one thing that we could safely assume is that domestic would potentially pick up ahead of international.
I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption to make. That gets around a lot of the sort of border closures, obviously, but also probably from a human psychological point of view, people are probably going to be more comfortable with domestic travel before they are international travel.
And are there any middle grounds there?
Actually, yeah, what we are starting to see are the equivalent of bubbles or smaller areas like Schengen, where countries are opening up just to each other. Australia and New Zealand saying that they'll be the first countries to open to each other. Where I am, Switzerland has announced that they will open to Austria and Germany and France in just over a couple of weeks. I think a natural other one would have been Canada and the US. Given the current situation, it seems to be the opposite, where they've just announced a further month of the border being closed between Canada and the US.
Right. And what we didn't mention at the beginning is that Jacob's career has taken him all the way from his home country of Canada to his home base now of Switzerland. So he has a really unique vantage point. So we've got some domestic travel, then potentially regional, before we really are even able to consider sort of international. So one of the other indicators that can help us understand what that looks like on a worldwide scale is that search indicator that you mentioned. Are we seeing anything in search already?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that the BCG portal measures that are sort of the change in search over the past couple of weeks. We're seeing some decent numbers of increased demand, particularly countries like Vietnam, South Korea are showing increased searching for travel, which is very promising to see. Same thing when you compare domestic to international, you are seeing more domestic searching positively increase than you are the international side.
And again, for those of you listening that are interested in actually researching this further and looking at the numbers yourself, that BCG trip portal, we will link below for you to have access to as well. It really is a fantastic wealth of information. So that's search. And then of course there's booking.
So booking actually, putting your money where your mouth is, what we're seeing in the search side does flow through. Again, improved number of tickets sold, especially in the Far East, particularly Vietnam, at least as of today. Another interesting thing that we're seeing on the domestic front are more one-way tickets being sold than round trips.
So that's interesting. So we've got the quarantine policies, we've got the searching and the booking, all of which are fairly concrete stats, right? So there is either a quarantine in place, someone has hit the search button or not, and then there's whether someone's paid for a flight. The other one that you listed off initially was intent, right? So how are people feeling in general, which is a much more subjective stat, but an earlier indicator potentially than the searching or booking. What would you actually rely upon to gauge intent?
There's a couple major buckets, again, well defined by the BCG folks. One are just overall economic indicators that are available. So everything from GDP, growth or decline, to free amount of funds for families to spend. Another actual customer sentiment. So taking it a step back from doing the search, but actually asking people what is their intent to travel. So surveys being a key tool in that space, and getting an idea from that about when people are willing and going to take the plunge and traveling again, both domestically and internationally.
I think that's a really interesting one to watch, and to find a source that you really feel like you can rely upon, which for those of you who have worked with surveys before, survey science really is a science. There's a lot that goes into how you ask the question, what channels you're using to reach your prospects, et cetera. So to find something that you can rely upon would be really, really helpful, I think, right now. Based on all of those factors that we just discussed, when do we think it will increase?
So the good news is it is already starting to increase. My favorite flight tracking website, flightradar24.com, published this week that the 7-day moving average total number of flights finally increased above 100,000 for the first time since the end of March. So that's one very positive sign that we're seeing. Another are airlines' schedules that they're producing for June. Those have come out over the past few days. And most of the ones I've seen show a market increase, both in schedule in terms of cities being served again, as well as the number of flights to cities that are already being served. I think a lot of it will continue, especially as we've mentioned some of the announcements, both of the bubbles, but also individual countries opening up their borders. I think it's a natural expectation that that will continue to increase as we finally hear about July schedules.
That being said, even though there are talks of reopening all over the world, actually, at this point, do we think that the airline industry is going to look like it did 2 or 3 months ago by the end of the year?
No, I don't think end of the year is reasonable at all. Of course, they're nothing but guesses and nobody really knows. The overall consensus, as best I can see, is that it will take at least 2 years to return to the 2019 levels of airline industry as we know them. How fast it gets to that 2019 level, is it going to be a steep ramp up coming up to the 2-year mark, or is it going to be a linear ramp up from today? Nobody quite knows. I think the expectation or the overall consensus is that it will be a slow ramp up at first, and then hopefully it gets better and better, and we see those 2019 levels restored.
And in the meantime, if we have less flights going and less people willing to fly at the same time, arguably that will have an impact on prices.
For sure. Obviously, today we're seeing some pretty great deals for traveling. There's some steals out there if you're willing to book, and we can get into that a little bit later. But how that will flatten out in the long run, will demand exceed supply, will supply exceed demand? We don't know. I think most interesting to pay attention to will be what airlines do in their pricing departments, the folks that they call revenue management, which is its own science in itself, how airlines sort of re-examine those practices and make decisions about the future as a result.
Are there any estimates out there right now for what might happen?
The consensus, as I've read it, is that there is an expectation that air travel will be more expensive than it was before this crisis hit, that airlines will operate on a smaller level, at a more profitable level, on a per person or per passenger level.
So far, we've talked about the fact that the current capacity has dropped a lot, but there are still flights going, and we're starting to see some flight schedules actually pick back up already, which is great. We know that the flight prices right now are really good. There is a chance, it's dependent on a lot of things, that those will go up. So should we be thinking about booking in the near future?
Yeah, it's of course a very personal decision that you have to be comfortable with. From my point of view, yeah, absolutely, you should go ahead and book with an airline. And a couple of the reasons are, one, should you decide not to travel, pretty much every major airline is offering flexibility, meaning that if you decide not to go on that trip later, you can take the amount that you paid as a voucher, sort of as a credit for future travel, without having to pay the classic airline change fee. It is important to remind people at that point that that doesn't mean that you'll not have to pay anything extra, as whatever flight that you decide to take in the future will be at its price. So you're not guaranteed another seat at the same price, but you are guaranteed to keep that money in that voucher format.
Right. And for context, there, those change fees can be north of $200, $250.
And one other important detail about these vouchers is most of the major carriers have now made them valid for 2 full years, which previously in the industry was unheard of. You would never get a credit for more than a year from your date of purchase. Now you're getting 2 full years.
Amazing.
The other really important point to keep in mind if you decide to travel in the near future is that should your flight be canceled, or in the DOT's words, again, US focused point, significantly changed, then you are entitled to a refund. There are similar regulations as well in Europe. EU 261 is the classically referred to regulation that governs cases of cancellations and delays and airlines' obligations therein.
So yeah, at least from the airline industry perspective, it's a good time to fly if you can go with regulations that the airlines are suggesting. So, the face masks, the social distancing, and obviously you're comfortable. Every airline is different in terms of the seat capacity that Jacob was just mentioning. So research that, think about it, and know that you are protected financially, much more so than ever before. And that is, by design, that's to incentivize people to feel comfortable booking, for sure. I think the other thing that I would just add here from an analytical perspective is there's a natural feeling to say, am I going to get sick if I fly? When I think the question that actually bears asking is, what is my greater risk if I fly than if I just live my life here? And finding that answer is really difficult, and we could spend an entire episode on that. But it's actually the differentiation, it's the delta in your risk profile, not that you have 0 at home and then you have 100% in the air. So just keep that thinking in mind.
Very well said. I completely agree with you.
On that note, so regarding analytical thinking, the point of the data mind is, again, to talk about what the data is actually saying from people who actually know. And it's really to use these podcasts and blogs as episodic examples of how to apply that kind of thinking. We really appreciate you doing that here with us, Jacob, regarding the airline industry in such an interesting time. But I would love to know, just in general, what advice you would have for our listeners on how they should be looking at data to make any decision.
It's a great question. One of the classic warnings I give any new analyst that I work with is to be careful not to confuse correlation and causation. I would hope they would learn that in school these days, but just in case they haven't, classic analytical example that floats around the community is the correlation between ice cream sales and murder rate. And, they positively correlate. Of course, it's not the case that an increase in ice cream sales causes an increase in murder rates. What's really going on there, of course, is in better weather, ice cream sales are higher as more people are out enjoying the nice weather and want ice cream. And when the weather is better, more people are out on the street. There are more interactions between people. There are more altercations, and a very small percentage end in murders. And thus, murder rates go up with better weather, which also increases ice cream sales.
That is dark. Hello, summer. Thanks, Jacob.
A great story that also floats around the analytical community about how human behavior sometimes is driving the numbers in a way that we might not necessarily anticipate in a logical way. So understanding the human behavior behind the numbers that you're looking at is so important. One of my favorite stories to remind people of this phenomenon is what happened in the Houston airport. This is a story from many years ago now. But was having issues with complaints related to timing about baggage being delivered. They were getting a lot of complaints above the national average. The natural result was for them to action these stats and hire more baggage handlers to improve their delivery system itself. And they were able to reduce the average wait time to the national average. Complaints didn't have a material change, as I remember the story. And the insight and what finally drove change was to understand that humans fundamentally really don't like inactive time. And they perceive it as very different. And the solution that the airport ended up using in the end was to increase the walk time between arrival and getting to the baggage hall. So using gates that were further away, increasing the path that was used to get to the baggage delivery spot. And once people were spending more time walking and active versus waiting, the number of complaints dropped, even though the amount of time didn't change.
That is fascinating. And I never, ever would have guessed that it was by design that I was walking so damn much throughout the airport and that they were actually doing it to make me happier. I mean, I have to admit that when I get to the baggage claim or customs or wherever I'm needing to get to and the thing I need is there or there's no line, it's like great. So
myself, if I'm in a lineup, as long as I feel like there's some progress being made, even if it's slow progress, then I notice that I'm maybe in a better mood, even if my total waiting time is less.
I love that example, though. I absolutely love it. I'm nowhere near as smart as Jacob. I don't have my degree in math. I have my degree in economics. And I think behavioral economics was always the most fascinating because it was always the most real. Until you introduce that human element, you're going to get your models wrong every single time. Every time.
Exactly.
So I think that's an incredibly important reminder.
My pleasure.
Well, Jacob, thank you so much for all of your time and sharing all this incredible information with us. For those of you who are watching, if you enjoyed this, please do the whole YouTube podcast thing and subscribe, share. If you found it interesting and useful, that would be fantastic. Next up, we are going to be talking to a doctor of nuclear medicine, which I didn't even know as a field. So if you're curious, not only about what that is, but also what he thinks about the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically the measures that we have taken so far to fight it, please tune in next month to our podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me, Kaylee. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks, everyone.